Matthew 18, the outstretched hand at night. The living room smelled of damp cedar and rain-soaked coats, a welcome heaviness that anchored the 7 people scattered across the mismatched furniture. Outside, a late spring storm was throwing sheets of water against the bay window, but inside, the only sound was the rhythmic hum of Gideon's old refrigerator and the shifting of paper as Bibles were opened to the eighth discourse. Gideon sat in the worn leather armchair by the unlit fireplace, his spine straight, his face lined with the comfortable gravity of a man who had spent 40 years watching the text dismantle human assumptions. He looked around the circle, his eyes resting briefly on each face, on Thomas's white-knuckled grip on his study Bible, on Rachel's exhausted posture, on the nervous way Julian kept tapping his sneaker against the floorboard. Gideon did not try to fill the silence right away. He had learned long ago that the text worked best when you let the room breathe first. "We are looking for answers in him, but I think we are asking the wrong questions," Gideon said, his voice a low, steady baritone that instantly cut through the tension of the room. The disciples open Matthew 18 with a corporate strategy meeting. They want to know who holds the highest rank in the hierarchy of heaven. They want metrics. They want a corporate ladder. They wanted what any sensible person wants when they stake their life on an enterprise, Martha said, leaning forward from the edge of the sofa, her pen poised like a weapon over her notepad. If you are building an organization, you need an org chart. You need to know who has the final signature, who sets the boundaries, and who handles the executive decisions when things fracture. That isn't corporate, that's just survival. Gideon smiled faintly, leaning his head back against the leather. And Jesus responds by doing something entirely disruptive. He doesn't name an apostolic cabinet. He reaches into the crowd, pulls a young child into the dead center of their circle, and tells them that unless they turn around, unless they are radically converted and become like that child, they won't even cross the threshold of the kingdom, let alone govern it. "Because a child is innocent?" Rachel asked quietly from the corner of the love seat, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee mug. "Is that what he's looking for? A return to some kind of unblemished state before everything got so complicated?" "Not innocence, Rachel," Gideon said, turning his gaze to her. "A child in the ancient world had no legal status, no social leverage, no economic power, and no rights to defend. They were completely dependent on the mercy and provision of the householder. Jesus isn't praising childhood sentimentality. He is demanding voluntary lowliness. He is telling us that true greatness in his assembly is found in the willingness to strip away our social leverage and stand entirely dependent on him. That sounds fine until the lowliest people in the room get crushed by the people with all the leverage," Thomas barked, his voice rough and tight as he stared down at the text. "Look at the next verse. Jesus talks about stumbling blocks. He says if anyone causes one of these little ones who believe in him to sin, it would be better for him to have a heavy millstone hung around his neck and be drowned in the deep sea." That's not a soft, gentle sermon. That's a threat. That's cosmic vengeance for the vulnerable. "It is an absolute warning, Thomas," Gideon agreed, his voice remaining level, refusing to match the tradesman's heat, but validating the gravity of the words. "Jesus takes the protection of the weak so seriously that he uses the image of an execution at sea. But notice where the warning moves next. He transitions from the stumbling blocks we put in front of others to the stumbling blocks we carry inside ourselves. He says if your hand or your foot causes you to sin, cut it off. If your eye traps you, gouge it out." He is demanding a radical, agonizing self-policing before we ever start looking across the room to balance someone else's ledger. Julian shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes fixed on his worn sneakers, his voice dropping to a raw whisper that barely carried across the rug. "What if the hand and the foot have already done the damage? What if you sit here knowing you've spent years building your own stumbling blocks, and you're terrified that you've already disqualified yourself from the house entirely?" Rachel leaned forward, her eyes softening as she looked across at the younger man. "That's why the shepherd leaves the ridge, Julian. Look at verse 12. Jesus doesn't leave the 99 to punish the one that wandered off into the briars. He leaves the structure behind to track the wanderer down. He doesn't panic because the sheep got tangled. He rejoices when he finds it. It is not the will of the Father that a single one of these little ones should perish. But what happens when the sheep that wandered is actively destroying the rest of the flock?" Martha asked, her eyes narrowing as she tapped her notebook with her pen. "You cannot run a community on pure sentimentality." Jesus transitions immediately from the lost sheep to a courtroom protocol in verse 15. If a brother sins against you, you go to him privately. If he refuses to listen, you bring 2 or 3 witnesses. If he still shuts you out, you bring it to the whole assembly, the ecclesia. And if he rejects the assembly, you treat him like a pagan and a tax collector. You excommunicate him. You enforce the contract. Simon let out a short, cynical laugh from the shadow of the window frame, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. You like that part, don't you, Martha? A clean, 3-step execution plan to get rid of the liabilities. But you're missing the punchline of the whole chapter. Look at verse 18. Jesus looks at the group and says, "Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Does that sound familiar to anyone else here? He said it to Peter, Ethan said, looking up from his Greek lexicon. In chapter 16, at Caesarea Philippi, right after Peter confessed that he was the Christ, he handed Peter the keys of the kingdom and told him whatever he bound or loosed on earth would be ratified in heaven. Exactly, Simon said, leaning forward, the shadow leaving his face as he locked eyes with the rest of the room. He is repeating himself, and whenever God repeats a structural legal mandate almost verbatim, you need to pay very close attention because the architecture is shifting. In chapter 16, the keys were singular. They were handed to an apostolic leader at the foundation. But here in chapter 18, Jesus uses the plural pronoun. He takes the exact same legislative, judicial authority, the power to forbid and permit, to retain and remit, to determine who is inside and who is outside the boundary, and he hands it to the localized assembly. He decentralizes the power. He anchors it to a legal quorum, Gideon added, his voice catching the thread seamlessly. He says, "Where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I in the midst of them." In its primary context, that is not a comforting verse for a low-attendance prayer meeting. It is a judicial ratification clause. He is saying that when 2 or 3 witnesses stand together in unity to bind or loose, to confront sin and pursue restoration, his sovereign presence acts as the cosmic stamp of approval on their court. The localized assembly becomes his official embassy on earth. But the purpose of the court isn't destruction, Martha, Rachel said, her voice rising with a sudden, fierce clarity. The whole point of the 3 steps is to win the brother back. It's a rescue mission disguised as a legal process. It's the shepherd using witnesses to pull the sheep out of the pit before the frost sets in. Then how many times do we have to pull them out before we are legally allowed to change the lock on the gate? Simon asked, his voice sharp with the old wounds of institutional betrayal. Peter asked the exact same thing right after Jesus finished explaining the protocol. He thought he was being incredibly generous. He offered a metric. "Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? Up to 7 times?" He wanted a boundary line to protect his own sanity. And Jesus completely obliterates the math, Gideon said, his eyes reflecting the soft lamplight as he leaned forward, his hands open over his knees. He doesn't say 7, he says 77 times, or 70 times 7. He takes Peter's human limitation and expands it into infinity. He's telling us that the judicial authority of the assembly is completely inseparable from a mandate of infinite, immeasurable grace. "How is that fair?" Thomas muttered, his jaw tight as he stared at the floorboards. "If there are no limits on the forgiveness, then the rules don't mean anything. The damage just keeps happening." "Let the king explain the economics of it, Thomas," Gideon said quietly, turning his Bible toward the final movement of the text. Jesus tells a story about a servant who owed his master 10,000 talents. Do you know what that number means? A single talent was worth about 20 years of a working man's labor. 10,000 talents is an astronomical, absurd, fictional figure. It is the national debt of an empire. It is a sum so massive that generations of human labor could never wipe it clean. The servant falls on his knees and begs for patience, promising to pay it back, which is a completely delusional promise. And what does the master do? He doesn't restructure the loan. Moved with profound compassion, he releases him and cancels the entire unpayable debt in a single sentence. Julian let out a slow, trembling breath, his shoulders dropping slightly as he listened to the weight of the math. He just let it go. He let it go. Gideon nodded, his voice dropping to a whisper that held the room completely still. But then, that same servant exits the chamber, walks down the street, and finds a fellow servant who owes him 100 denarii, a few months' wages, a real debt, a measurable debt, but microscopic compared to the mountain he just left behind. And instead of extending the mercy he just received, he grabs the man by the throat, chokes him, and throws him into debtor's prison because he demands his legal rights. And the king finds out, Chloe said from the edge of the hearth, her voice breaking her long silence, her eyes wide with the sudden, terrifying realization of the text. He calls the wicked servant back into the courtroom. He hands him over to the torturers until he can pay back the original unpayable debt. And Jesus ends the whole chapter by looking at them and saying, "This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother from your heart." "The boundary isn't a checklist, Martha," Simon said, his arms slowly dropping to his sides as the rain continued to drum against the glass outside. "The authority to bind and loose isn't a weapon to protect our professional reputations or our corporate peace of mind. If we use the keys to lock people out while standing on a foundation of canceled debt we didn't earn, the master will rewrite the ledger." Gideon stood up slowly, the old wood of the floorboards creaking beneath his feet as he closed his Bible and set it on the mantel. He looked around the circle one last time, the settled, assured peace of his own long-tested life filling the quiet spaces of the room. "The text has done its work for tonight," Gideon said, offering his hand to Julian to help him up from the low chair. "The storm outside is clearing and the road is open. Let's move on."